For 20 years, beginning in the late 1960s, the infamous Black Mafia was involved in extortion, murder, drug trafficking, and embezzlement in the predominantly African-American sections of Philadelphia. The organized group, one of the bloodiest crime syndicates in modern U.S. history, collapsed in the late 1980s after several successful prosecutions and internal conflict. Who were Philadelphia's Black Mafia, and what can we learn from them about organized crime in general?
We call it the jungle because it's you might as well say it's a comparison to where the colored folks first came from. Like, we came from Africa, most of us. And it's a comparison, like they be running around in the jungles and everything.
I think the jungle really gave us, through the name, say, mostly the policemen, because all the boys in the gangs and things be fighting, running through the streets, shooting one another, and things like that.
Yes, and the strongest survives. That's what I'm trying to say. Just like it's in the jungle, that's the way it is up here. The strongest have to survive. If you're weak, you ain't gonna survive.
When it comes to organized crime, most people think La Cosa Nostra, the Russian Mafia, or even the Japanese Yakuza. But Black America has a rich and long history when it comes to organized crime in this country. And one of the best examples of this is Philadelphia's Black Mafia.
I think it's safe to say that when most of us think mafia or organized crime, we don't think Black Mafia. And yet this was a group that made its mark for 20 years, beginning in the 1960s, and you say was linked to some of the most heinous crimes in Philadelphia history. Who were they?
Well, Philadelphia's Black Mafia is a fascinating group. They began, by most accounts, in the early to mid-1960s. They formed around certain particular neighborhoods in Philadelphia. Most of them knew each other, either from childhood or mostly from youth gangs. Many of them had violent criminal backgrounds. In fact, all of them had criminal backgrounds. In the early years, meaning the mid-1960s, for the most part, we're talking in the dozens, they self-selected themselves by territory in the sense that people knew who they were. Their mainstay in the early to mid-1960s was extortion. What that meant literally was that they would go up to drug dealers and other illicit entrepreneurs like numbers runners, prostitution rings, and ask them for a street tax. And if people didn't pay, they would be harmed physically. And that's how they began. Nothing spectacular. And of course, back then, law enforcement, for the most part, treated organized crime as an Italian-specific phenomenon. So all throughout the 1960s, as the Black Mafia grew and grew, they were pretty much untouched by law enforcement.
Philadelphia's Black Mafia started during the 1960s and was nothing more than a few street gangs in South Philadelphia. Philly's Black Mafia was allegedly formed by Samuel Christian, and under his as well as other founding members' leadership, the Black Mafia would consolidate power throughout various African-American neighborhoods. The Black Mafia, who was heavy into the heroin trade, is said to have found allies within the Bruno crime family, as well as the Gambino crime family, which only further grew their drug empire. Like Italian mobsters, an oath of secrecy was required to be taken in order to become a member of the Black Mafia. Philadelphia's Black Mafia would even go on to create several non-profit organizations like Black Bee Inc. to stop gang killings and clean up trash in the city, and would even receive government grants for these efforts. However, it would be discovered that these were fronts, aimed at furthering their criminal enterprise as well as getting rid of any rival gangs.
Because law enforcement was not watching, it was impossible for people in black sections of the city to imagine that these ultra-violent criminals, and I'll get to their crimes in a moment, but these ultra-violent criminals were not being targeted by law enforcement. And one of the fascinating things about Philadelphia's Black Mafia, they rose to power just as the federal government in the 1960s had what they thought was a revolutionary idea of providing funding to gangsters and to gang members. And what that meant in Philadelphia's case was, if you were a member of the Black Mafia, you could actually apply for government funding, and that's why the book is called Black Brothers, Inc. They actually incorporated themselves in October of 1973.
And received government funds.
Absolutely, and they actually had a storefront on South Street in South Philadelphia. And so for the poor victims to all this mayhem that they're causing, and by the way, the Black Mafia murdered far more people than the Bruno crime family ever did in Philadelphia. They murdered over 4 dozen people. If you're a member of an African-American section of the city, you're watching known criminals not only getting money, but taking photo ops with politicians, being listed on the grants. One of the things that struck me as a researcher 30 years after the fact was I wrongly and naively assumed that surely if I got the government documents, these Black Mafia members would not have put their own name on the documents, that they would have used some front name or front company. And in fact, they used their own name because that was the idea. And when I tracked down the politicians who were responsible for giving that money out, and I asked them, do you look back on those times and question the public policy there of actually courting known criminals? And the response I got uniformly from politicians was those were very, very tough times in urban areas. Crime was running rampant, and we were trying to do radical things.
Hey, what's up, guys? I wanted to take a second to remind you, please hit that subscribe button. And if you like what we're doing and want to make a donation, you can do that via Cash App at American Made Channel. Now, let's jump into the video.
Philadelphia's Black Mafia, unlike the Italian Cosa Nostra, had no rules when it came to committing violence. This meant civilians, both men and women, would be killed if necessary, making them far more ruthless than the Italian syndicates.
Tell us, if you would, about some of the most notorious crimes committed by the Black Mafia.
Sure. Well, there are a few in the early 70s that really put them on the map. The first was the January 1971 DeBrow's Furniture Store robbery/arson/murder, where 8 Black Mafia members went into DeBrow's Furniture Store, a large, popular furniture store on South Street in Philadelphia at the time. They went in the store in pairs, announced a holdup, and in addition to robbing the establishment and beating several patrons, they took all of the employees and tied them with duct tape and electrical cord and stacked them on top of each other in the back of DeBrow's Furniture Store. In the course of the robbery, one of the employees, a janitor, actually came back from lunch break, came up from a janitor in a freight elevator, and was shot point blank because the Black Mafia assumed it must have been somebody from law enforcement breaking in on the robbery. He was killed, and in addition to his death, as they were leaving, they not only set the establishment on fire by pouring gasoline all throughout the furniture store, they set the employees on fire. They doused the employees with gasoline and set them on fire. It was only by chance that the employees, for the most part, survived unscathed. One employee was severely injured. The one that starts the Black Mafia investigation, both in the Philadelphia area and nationally, was a case in April of 1972, in a famous club called the Club Harlem in Atlantic City, where a major drug dealer named Fat Tyrone Palmer was there with his entourage. We would nowadays call it a posse, literally with his bodyguards and a handful of women seated stage side. And as a show is going on at 2 in the morning, there are 600 to 800 people in the establishment. 4 Black Mafia members approach Fat Ty Palmer over a drug debt and execute him in front of the entire crowd. That was the one that started the Black Mafia investigation. The short version of that story is that Atlantic City Police called Philadelphia's police department and asked them for assistance on cracking this Black Mafia case, to which the Philadelphia Police Department's organized crime unit said, what is the Black Mafia? Those memos are fascinating to read years later because law enforcement had no idea this was going on.
In fact, it was, you say in your book, infighting and eventual prosecutions that ultimately brought down the Black Mafia.
By 1974, 21 members and affiliates of the Black Mafia were arrested in an early morning raid. This would be the beginning of the end. The Black Mafia would fracture and reform several times, and in the 1980s, Philadelphia's Black Mafia became the Junior Black Mafia, organized and modeled after La Cosa Nostra, or the Italian Mafia. Some members were even seen in the company of Philadelphia mob boss Skinny Joey Merlino. It is alleged that the Junior Black Mafia is still active and has a presence in the city of Philadelphia and even parts of southern New Jersey and Maryland. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Black America has a rich and long history when it comes to organized crime in this country. And I encourage you to do more research on your own, as this was only an overview of Philadelphia's Black Mafia. Thanks for checking out the video. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and keep following American Made.